evening and welcome to the penultimate of the Galloway Glens events.
Oh,
I have a bit of an echo in the background, so if people are unmuted, could they please unmute themselves? Unmuted, please mute yourselves. Apologies that this evening is going to be not a hybrid event, but I think we all know the situation now with COVID. So we've gone back to the Zoom format, which we've been doing for a while. So the first speaker tonight in Inspirational Threave will be Sam Gallagher. Now, Sam's very recently left the Threave project to take up a post in Glasgow, but Sam's been a key element of getting this whole thing off the ground. Sam and myself have been working pretty hard on this now for 2 or 3 years to get it all working, and it's happening, and it is inspirational. So Sam, over to you.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nick, for the invitation to speak, and it's great to be speaking about Threave Landscape Restoration Project, probably for the last time in public. That sounds a little bit political, but it's been a wonderful journey that I've had with this project, and working with Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme has been absolutely fantastic, and all the other partners, Connor, and of course the team at Threave, David Thompson and his team of volunteers. So really this evening I'm wanting to set the scene a little bit about the project and talk a little bit more about concept of the project as well. So I'm going to probably ask Nick to come in on different points as well, and really just give you a flavour of the thinking behind Threave Landscape Restoration Project. So we're looking at Kelton Mains, the site, 81 hectares, a former intensive dairy farm. It is typical of many farms across the United Kingdom. Straight fences, stock fences, square rectangular fields, tight compartments of forestry plantation. It is, unfortunately, ecologically underperforming traditionally. So what we're doing with this project is looking at ways that we can work with nature, how we can tweak processes that we would normally do on a site like this, and see how we can be much more holistic. Our intention is to improve the biodiversity of Kelton Mains, and it's also to provide habitats that are self-adapting and self-adapting to Scotland's changing climate. And what we're really doing is we're looking at a different way of land management. So getting away from those compartments into looking at habitat zones. And we have a really positive message. And it's a positive message that nature has the power to regenerate and restore itself. And at Threave, we've got a great example of that. Over 15 years now, we've had the Osprey Conservation Programme. So many chicks have fledged, and it really has been wonderful that from empty skies of these wonderful raptors for so long in southwest Scotland, we have this very stable and growing population. And for us, it is a really positive message that we want to share with our visitors. And all we did really was, from a human point of view, was to put in a nest. That was the tweak that we made to allow nature to thrive. So Threave Landscape Restoration Projects taking this up, scaling it up into an 81 hectare scale. So I think we all know where we are. So we're in southwest Scotland, Castle Douglas. We have the Threave estate. And what we're looking at is one part of Threave estate called Kelton Mains. And it's got a kind of advantage in that it's surrounded by really important designated locations, SSSI, SPA, Ramsar. So what our project's doing is putting the keystone into this network of listed sites to strengthen them, but also to provide some more kind of critical mass momentum behind the work that we're all involved with. So the aspirations in terms of what we're doing, I mentioned about that positive message on restoring biodiversity. We also talk about a 100-year plan. We're not expecting things to happen straight away. We're also aware that things are going to change and things that are out with our control. We've just had yet another very high impact storm in Storm Arwen. I still remember Storm Ali from 2 years ago. We need to accept these changes in a way and hope that we can provide the right type of context and framework for these natural processes to deal with that and to maximize the opportunity. Of course, it's learning from mistakes as well. We're not expecting these things to be instant solutions or permanent solutions. And one of the nice things for the National Trust for Scotland to be leading on a project such as this is that we have the appetite, we have the capacity and resources to plan long term. It's our 90th anniversary this year, and it'd be great that in 100 years' time, we will still have a really positive legacy from this project we've started at Threave. Important kind of unique selling point of the project, we wanted it to be kind of innovative, potentially a UK first in the conversion of a former dairy farm. We know there actually are quite a few other projects doing things in this way, but we are a kind of focus for Southern Scotland, which is great. And of course, an impact that we want to have is as an exemplar for other landowners and farmers in new methods of land management. We're not advocating that we would replicate the wholesale smorgasbord petri dish that we're creating at Threave. That's not what it's about. But there might be elements that could be relevant to farmers and landowners across the country. And in fact, already within the Trust, we're taking some of the learning that we're getting from the project and putting it into different locations up in the Western Isles, Ben Lomond as well. And of course, that element of education is core to the National Trust for Scotland. We want this to be very much a public activity. So we're looking at the kind of didactic elements of the project quite strongly. We want people to come and have an experience which will change them. It will connect them to these ideas of habitat restoration. It will demonstrate in action ways to mitigate climate change and how they can be part of that too. So taking all those kind of ideas, working with Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership, so many hours with Nick on site and in meetings, with David at the National Trust for Scotland, and with Connex, our partners, the ideas came into this sense of concept and into this design. So we're stripping away, like I said, those kind of fields and boundaries as before. And what we're looking at instead is these kind of habitat zones. So a kind of wetland habitat zone, a grassland habitat zone, and a woodland habitat zone. And we'll refer more to these during the presentation. And what we're kind of doing in the current package of works are different interventions to support each of these habitat zones. And they've kind of got quite kind of interesting names and fun names, partly, again, just to kind of refer to that public engagement of what the project's all about from a conceptual point of view. We started right at the beginning of the year with Wilder Woods, felling conifer larch plantations and some beech, which wasn't in quite the right location to be providing a great habitat, changing our management plan. And the idea is to create this much larger kind of 30-hectare woodland to the east of the site. We're quite open-minded about deer management. Again, that's part of the experiment we want to be engaging with to see which methods might work best and test and allow us to test different methods from regeneration to replanting, the type of deer defense we might look at. But community engagement is a really important part. And it's been great to see the other week volunteers planting the first trees on site, some 200 plus aspen planted, which is kind of a symbolic moment in the project's development. Now, of course, with creating these habitat zones, a really important part has been the kind of defencing of the site itself. And I think almost 5 kilometers have now been taken by David and his team. Fantastic work and just transforming, liberating the landscape. It's a great activity to do. It's great to see that change. But of course, we're also tying back to that older tradition, which I think other speakers may be touching on this idea of the levelers, of this sense of kind of land management, historic land management, and some of the controversies around that. Our own controversy, I suppose, has been how do we manage livestock in a site without any fences? This was the problem, really, that Nick came up with found a solution for us. I was desperate to get rid of the fences. I really was keen to create these very open spaces, different visitor experience, different experience for nature. But the cows, which have a really important role to play in terms of the conservation grazing in the grasslands, but also in the woodlands, how do we be able to manage them? And it was great that through the grapevine, we were introduced to No Fence, this Norwegian company working with their GPS tagged herds. And we've got a really great local conservation partner in the Davison family who've been supporting us with this work. And what's great is it's gone from suggestion to concept to reality. So in our grazing, our grassland area, we now have our coos they've gone through their, well, we're discussing it, whether it's cow university or coo school or maybe a cow college, but they're learning how to work with these collars. Nick, do you want to maybe come in and tell us a little bit more about, is this successful so far? What's our first results on our coo experiment?
Yeah, thus far it's working very well. The coo college, I think, is what we may have settled on, unless someone can come up with a better name. So at the moment, the cows are in paddocks, and the collars around the necks, and the basically how it works is we have a virtual fence that the cows can't see. And when the cow gets closer and closer to the fence, it plays an increasingly loud note until the cow then turns around. If it goes too far, it gets a small pulse, and that's kind of the last reminder. And it takes a little while for them to work out, but only days really before they work out, but to turn around on the sound of music, I suppose. So what it means is we can make any shaped paddock we want. We can do things like where you had the examples where the woodland edge is now unfenced. You could actually have the woodland edge creeping out a little bit, or you could have cattle going in within the wood. And it just works through mixture GPS and mobile phone signals. Now, 1 or 2 cows have escaped early doors, but not very many. And it tends to be an odd individual animal that escapes. And then because they're a herd animal, it goes, oh, I've got to get back to my herd. And it's important to remember, whilst they get a pulse when they go too close to the fence, once they leave the fence, they no longer get any pulses. So then the animal then goes back to the herd, but at the same time, the grazier gets an automatic text notification that one of the cows is out. So yeah, thus far it seems to be working very well. It's early days, and there's going to have to be a bit of education with the public, because this is a public access site. But I think it's important to note that the first site that I saw this done on, which inspired me to bring it to NTS, was Epping Forest. And in the best will in the world, Threave will probably never get as busy as Epping Forest. And there's been hardly any problems with cows on Canary Wharf. So I think it seems to be, it's well-proven technology.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thank you. So another element is on the wetlands, and there's a project we've been calling Dambusters. It's about removing off bunds to allow the Galloway Dee to do its thing in part of its historic flood plain. Seebeck, wonderful company, really worked out the hydrology and all the potential impacts and benefits of the project. And what's really nice is, and I sadly missed it, but the dam has been broken, and we've got these fantastic images from Chris Stones, I think, from his drone, showing this wetland in action, creating this dynamic space that is interacting with the wider hydrology of the Ken Dee Basin. A really fantastic achievement to bring this back into play. Nick, anything you want to maybe add on this? What are we going to maybe see in coming years now that we have re-established this important kind of connection with the river?
I think it's important to note that the bund is extremely old. We don't know really how old it is. I think it appears in some form of been rebuilt multiple times, but on the oldest maps we can find for the Kelton Main site. So how long the bund's been there, we don't know, but there was a wetland behind the bund, but it flooded on an infrequent occasion, once or twice a year, sometimes once every 2 years. It flooded from the bottom up and became pretty stagnant, and it wasn't really connected to the landscape in a functioning way. So this has been designed so that it floods on what in hydrology we call of the 15th percentile flood. So basically, it will now flood between 10 and 20 times a year on sort of like moderately high flows. and behave how that wetland and floodplain would behave in a natural situation, and that'll bring a lot more diversity of flora and fauna through the whole area. And it's only 2 small breaches, but it does have a little break in the bund there, which obviously you'll have pretty wet feet if you're trying to walk around it. But very shortly, there's going to be a boardwalk which will cross across the wetland and back onto the main circular route.
Great. So as well as looking at the wetland, it's also about some of the other waterways that are on the site. So we've got the Millburn, which has been kind of dredged and straightened over the decades, becoming part boundary, but really a field drain. And it's been really nice to start seeing how we can really put some life back in to this important waterway, which runs to the west of the site. And that's been achieved as well this year. So from that concept, it's now come into practice with these bundles of brash put in to slow down the flow, to allow the sediment to gather up and create a much more favorable habitat for fish and other invertebrate which we just expect in a waterway such as the Millburn. And of course, as Nick mentioned, as things get wetter, it's really important that we are able to keep visitor access, and the creation of boardwalks, which have been a little bit delayed from what we wanted, partly due to kind of timber supply, but scheduled for next spring, will really be quite a fantastic experience. We're kind of almost walking on water and providing that access to visitors to the whole site. We're also interested in doing new research. So we know the goose population is very interesting. Migratory geese, we're used to that winter roost, but we also have a native population. We're keen to understand how they interact with the site. And part of the project is focusing on that, working with Larry Griffin, who's been commissioned as a consultant to be tracking some of the native geese populations. This is a really nice part of the project because it is tying us to the heritage of Threave and the National Trust for Scotland, and the bequest that we received from Major Alan Gordon. When he left the estate to the trust, it wasn't about the house. There was no garden at the time. It was about these wetlands. And this is the first project we've been able to do for some 60 years that is actually addressing directly the terms of the bequest. So it's a really nice connection to our own heritage. And telling our stories, as you can imagine from NTS, is hugely important. And we really want to make sure that we are connecting with all different elements of the history of the site. Part of that has been archaeology, and this summer was a busy year for various archaeological surveys of the site, test pits and metal detecting, as well as some excavations to see that connection that we have with thousands of years of human occupation. What's quite exciting, you may have seen the story the other year, that one of the projects that we supported discovered this burnt hazelnut, which is 10,000 years old, dated 8,000 BC, and is apparently not burned in a natural fire. They can attest that it's actually a sign of human occupation. So it just goes to show that long relationship that we have with the land and how we've all made our impact on the landscape. And this project isn't so much about looking just at the past, it is about how we add our own chapter to managing Threave and the changes that we will be making for future generations. So there's just some key points as kind of takeaway for the concept of what Threave Landscape Restoration Project is all about. It's a total approach. Nature leads, but it's including and maintaining the social, cultural, agricultural, historical, archaeological elements. So it's a really that's why we've kind of gone with landscape as opposed to ecological restoration or rewilding or any other phrase that may be associated with a project such as ours. We're looking at landscape completely. And it's been one of the nice things as well to bring to HSBC, who's now funding the project into the future, which is a really nice testament to the work the whole team's put in over the years to get it to this point, that we're adding something quite different, that it's climate change and tackling climate change and the environmental crisis isn't just scientific. It requires a lot more buy-in across the board. And this holistic approach we're taking into how we approach the natural elements of the project into the wider ecosystem. We're not focusing on just willow tits or a particular plant it's about the total biomass of the site. And it's been really interesting to look at different frameworks which allow us to evaluate the success of this broader approach. And we're not creating a nature reserve with a very particular outcome that we have to break our backs trying to maintain. This is something quite different. I mentioned already about land not being managed as fields and compartments, but habitat zones, and the topography of the site is so important to allowing us to do it. It's really kind of interesting topography. And I think as those water levels stabilize, as we see those kind of increased flood events, we should have much more of a sense of archipelago. So feeding onto that very beautiful image we all have of Threave Island and Threave Castle, we should hopefully have a sense of more islands and crossing between these islands using the boardwalk network. Experimental, just to underline that really important point, that we are kind of looking to work with change. We're expecting things to go wrong, though admittedly I don't think, Nick, anything has gone wrong yet in any major way, but we're going to build that into the project. And of course, it's about people, people, people. This is participation, education. We want people to come, engage with us, challenge us, to bring new ideas. And I think one of the most enriching parts of the project, from my point of view, has been exactly that, how we talk about the project and make the 30,000 plus visitors, and we're expecting visitor numbers to grow on this site, really part of the project as well. And I think when we come to that sense of changing climate, changing culture, that this is a unique power of this site, that we can engage people in the heritage and history of the wider landscape, of our own power to influence it, and also the potential to work with nature for a much better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was really good. I mean, and you posed a question: has anything gone wrong yet? No. It's all. It's been. I think everyone should realise how hard the team at NTS has worked, and Connix and CBEC, to make this happen. There's been a huge amount of regulatory obstacles to go through. Regulations which are there for good reason, but sometimes when you try to do something innovative, make life a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. But all the regulators have worked extremely hard to make this happen. And we're very lucky with, I don't think you mentioned enough there, Sam, with the young farmers which have come onto the project, the Davidsons, who have taken a very modern approach to what they're doing, and are really excited and engaged with the whole project. So it's also quite important to note that they've chosen cattle specifically for this project. So they're not cattle that are going to be too wild. They've been humanized to a certain extent. So we have a question in here, Sam, which I'd like you to pick up on. How is NTS going to monitor an increase or improvement in the biomass and biodiversity from their site? That's from Alice Baker, I believe.
Hi, Alice. I think that's it's a fundamental question to us. I mean, there's lots of baseline studies that were created in phase 1 of the project. So a huge amount of work was about just data collecting. And I think that Threave, from this point of view, or Kelton Main site at Threave, is probably one of the most studied areas in Scotland now. So the amount of studies that we've commissioned has provided us a baseline, and we should be able to see over the course of years, by continuing a really strong monitoring regime, how we're improving on these different factors. So in terms of counts, in terms of soil sampling. But also we're wanting to push ourselves a little bit more as well. And one of the frameworks we're going to be taking on is ecological outcome verification, which is something that I mean, maybe others and maybe David Thompson, if he's on the call, might want, or Hugh Connick, if he's with us, might be able to say a little bit more. But there's only better ways now to be monitoring these increases and improvements, and we're wanting to kind of be one of the first projects in the UK to be using this new methodology, which will grade and present a much stronger kind of trend in what we're able to achieve in this way, because everyone's talking about biomass and biodiversity, but it is about needing to find the right metrics, and we think we've got one in the ecological outcome verification framework.
I mean, a comment in there as well about any particular species that don't currently breed at Threave that you hope will breed in the future. I don't think we have anything in particular in mind. It would be great if some of the the new natives return to Threave in the future. I think it's all about allowing the landscape to form its own biodiversity, but to do it through natural means.
Yeah, I'd also spin it as well. I mean, we are lucky, and I think we have to give credit to those surrounding areas that provide a kind of source of wildlife, the SPA, the Triple SI, the Ramsar, and what we'd love to see isn't so much new things, but the spread of what we have. So some of the wealth of Threave, and it is already, as a wider estate, ecologically rich. It's about seeing an expansion of that, especially an expansion on the kind of quality of some of these surrounding sites into this land that was formerly intensively farmed. I think that will be a really interesting thing to see, how the spread of the seed source is going to kind of impact the wider site as the soil starts to change at a chemical level, as its treatment and use changes at a higher level. So that will be kind of a key thing to be there.
And it will be very much something for our grandchildren to also monitor, which is very important to note. Before we move on to the next presenter, there's one comment there I'll just answer very quickly. I noticed grouse sputters are being mentioned. Will there be grouse shooting on the site? There will probably never be grouse on the site. It's entirely the wrong type of habitat. And I think it's just the terminology is being used. So these grouse sputters will be the sorts of places where people will be viewing platforms. There'll be a bit of interpretation there. So it's in a sense a little bit of using old heritage building styles on the site to provide an interpretation and viewpoint for the public. Okay, there's a couple more questions in the room there, Sam. If you'd like to jump into the chat room and start answering them, and we'll move on to the next presentation. Now, Archie Mcconnell is the brains behind the Dumfriesshire Archival Mapping Project, and has a remarkable interest in maps, history, and things which are just quite interesting all the time. And we've asked Archie to have a look at the land around the site from a historical maps perspective. And he's going to present something on what they're doing and why on earth were they doing it. So Archie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. I really enjoyed the previous presentation too. Look, when I was thinking about what on earth were they doing and why, it was I came to the conclusion that actually what we're looking at, especially as far as maps are concerned, is lines in the landscape. And here we have Kelton Mains and the cattle in their coo school, or whatever you're calling it these days. And it's a traditional, if you like, landscape that we're looking at. But if you look a little deeper, it's layer upon layer of different agricultural change that has gone down. And looking back through the maps, we can have a look and we can see exactly what it is that's been going on. The project that you're talking about now is due to run for 100 years, but we're going to go back around about 270 years to General Roy's map, if we can have the next slide. And here it is, tagged as Ponce, but this is indeed General Roy's map. It was the military survey done between 1746 and 1755. What I would like you to look at here is the lines. If you look at this map, this is our baseline, if you like, for this particular talk. And we can see the boggy part through which the Carlingwalk burn goes, and the boggy parts out to the east of Castle Douglas, what was to become Castle Douglas. If you look at the lines in this map, most of them are wiggly. There's a few enclosures which are indeed square. It's easier to build a wall square rather than wiggly, just simply because it takes a shorter course. But in the main, what comes to your eye here is the wiggliness of the lines rather than anything else at all. If we move on now to the next map, compare to this one. And suddenly we're looking at 1900. This is the OS map for 1900. I know it's a bit fuzzy. We're not looking at places at this particular point. What we're looking at is lines. And we can see roads there. We can even see the railway going across and the diagonal that you've got. And the other important part in this neck of the woods is the quantity of ditches. And there are other lines marked in there as well. There's the inundation line. They were talking about that earlier with the flooding. And actually, it's all marked on this particular map. And also the bunds along the banking to try and hold the water back. And just as a by the by, I think the date is somewhere around about the 1820s, probably. There's a map of 1830s that is in Threave. And as far as I recall, that shows the bunds having been built. And there are various maps around about the 1800 mark, 1790s onwards, which don't show any sign of building of embankments on the side of the river. So that gives you a rough idea. So that they're not so long ago, really, 1820s. What I want to do over this talk is to just have a closer look at each individual type of line, if you like. So if we go on to the next slide. Marches or boundaries around estates. They indeed are very important lines. They're legal lines, if you like. On the top, we have the estate of Earlston in 1815. And what it shows is all the individual farms that would have been rented out. And it shows all the different markings, if you like, on the for each farm. And it shows the boundaries, the marches, very clearly. By 1815, most of these boundaries would have been had a dry stone dike on them. Previously, however, if you look at the bottom there, we have different sorts of boundary. These would have been done by what was called a perambulation, which was basically folk going out together and marking a boundary. And so you can tell that this is the case here because they show the things on the boundary that they go past, as in the three wedders or the lumps of what is it, Burnhead, the rocking stone, and such like things. So all these different markers, if you like, are the legal limits of the land. However, there is no line in the landscape. These would have been totally free. And as the map above, 1815, but we have one here much earlier, which is 1769, by a guy called Greg from Ayrshire. But it's also of the Earlston estate. On the left-hand side, we have another slightly more modern map, 1820s, and it's up near Carsfern. But still, there's no dikes on the boundaries here, so no lines in the landscape. There's merely stones, and as we can see, a pit as marking the boundary on this particular place. If we go on. The big thing as far as lines on the landscape is concerned are enclosures. And it should be noted that there were reasons for the enclosure. It wasn't just an arbitrary thing that happened. One of the big ones was the 1690s famine in Scotland, where nearly 25% of parts of Scotland died from lack of food. And it became a moral duty of landowners to improve their land so that there was more food for everybody. And that comes through very strongly with some writers. But by the middle of the century, you start to get what we'll call the capitalization of the landscape, with folk like Adam Smith and all the rest of them carrying on. And you get the surveyors coming in and marking everything just down to its nearest inch, virtually. In these maps, I've tried to give you a quick snap, quick look at this way of enclosure, if you like. The top one is in fact a map near Ecclefechan, over Canonby Way. And here we have an open landscape, and just the rigs are shown on the map. And there is no enclosure there at all. So any livestock would have been herded very well in order to keep them off crops and such like. On the left-hand side, there's a similar pattern going on. This is down near Caple. And in fact, that's Caple village, the little hamlet that you see in the top left of that map. But look more closely at the shapes that are being made by the rigs and also by the pasture land. And you'll see that they're sort of amorphous shapes and more like potatoes, lumps, if you like, and certainly not well squared in any way. However, at this point, we're talking around about 1769, and both these two maps are by James Wells. He is showing how he would divide up the landscape and divide it into different farms. And suddenly now you've got these lines running in a hard way straight across those what we'll call potato shapes of the more medieval landscape. So things are turning into a different way altogether. And what we're looking at now is we're looking at rotational crops as well as livestock going on. The bottom right, we have a map from Ayrshire. I find this totally stunning. It's 1815, and it's almost brutalist in its complexion. Each field is almost identical in size. You have roads that are put through in exactly the right place. It's part of the Earlston estate, and it must have been in its day one of the foremost and modernest of farms. But it's enclosure that is managing to do that. Okay. Of course, not everybody was happy with the idea of putting dikes up. There's a lot talked about the levelers, and you do have this leveler connection at Kelton. I'm ambivalent about the idea that the levelers were, as it were, socialists against the mean, nasty landowners. I don't think that was probably the case at all. There was too many other things going on, like religion, and they seem to attack a specific idea of enclosure. And that was driven by the importation of cattle from Ireland, which in turn was driven by legislation in London. And it was all a hodgepodge, if you like, of different things. But the interesting dike is that one almost bang in the middle of the screen, with the old military road coming from Carling Walk on your right and diagonally down the middle of the screen. And the dike just above it was the one that was in contention in 1723, 24, maybe it was 25. And the the dike there was going to be rumbled by a band of levelers, but it was avoided by the then owner, a Captain Johnson, and the local minister, who arrived in the nick of time with a large barrel of beer and quantities of sandwiches. And having explained that they weren't going to throw anybody off the estate, all was well, and this particular dike was spared. What he was actually trying to do, it seems to me, was to put a dike around his own property to keep his own cattle in and those going along the road out. If we go on to the next slide. Yeah, one of the big things obviously is roads that crisscross across the place. And when we think of roads in modern times, we're always thinking of people doing up the roads, or road works, or potholes, or whatever. And we don't really think of past roads in those terms at all. But actually, that was exactly what was going on in the late 18th century. If we look at the left, that's actually a road map done by John Gillan of, and you can see the little vignette, if you like, in the bottom of that little map, which is the ruin of New Abbey Abbey. And the road that he's marking out from A, you can see the letter A, and all the way up there, he's actually drawing up what the gradient is on each particular part of that road in order to get more traffic down towards New Abbey and on towards the coast. That was around about 1800, just afterwards. Prior to that, about 1790 something or other, is the other map here on the right-hand side. And we see the collision of roads. On the right-hand side, just above where I've written roads across it, it says military road. And below it, it says toll road. And the toll road was, of course, the turnpike. And this was the new road that was going in at the time. So we're talking about continual roadworks in Dumfries and Galloway are not a new thing. The map below is all one piece. It's georeferenced on the NLS site. Do go to that, by the way, because it's a fantastic bit of kit. And you can play around with the maps in all sorts of ways. But it's just by the Ken Bridge, and you can see very clearly the different markings on the one side, on the left, the 18th century, and on the right-hand side is modern day. We'd better pass on. I think I'm losing on time. Next slide, please. Rivers are another thing that we don't really think of in terms of lines, apart from having to cross it or to get a flood from it or some such. But in the old days, they were very much used for transport. And the Nith, the Ken D rivers, the Cree, all these, we have notes of timber coming down all these rivers at one time or another prior to the middle of the 19th century. So they were definitely used as transport, and something that doesn't happen anymore. In the top left, you can see, in fact, a picture. And if you can just squint your eyes, you can see the sailing boats sailing up Loch Ken on their way perhaps to collect logs, or perhaps even to take lime or some such over to the farmers further north. The arrow in the middle shows, roughly speaking, the location of Kelton, and it's important to note that as a Douglas stronghold, it sits pretty much, although next door to the banks of the Dee, it's in fact just in between the Dee and the and sits in a kind of a basin of lower ground and very fertile ground, which was, as we have seen, very boggy. If we have another slide. Rivers, of course, make islands. Rivers, of course, make islands, and we have the one that I'd like to point out to you is Coney Island there. This is just a little snippet of information for you. It's highly likely that that was indeed a place that grew lots of rabbits. And what particular time it was, I've seen 3 different names for this particular island: Lodge Island, Coney Island, and Kinnin Island have all been marked. And let us assume that there were rabbits there. We have to bear in mind at the end of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, we find that Dumfries is actually the center of the skin trade for the whole of the south of Scotland. And you see exports from Dumfries that included up to 25,000 hare skins were put through the port in 1 year, which is an enormous number if we think about the numbers there. The other sorts of things that they were putting out there were lamb skins, which you'd obviously think of, but swan skins was another thing that they listed. And another good one was dog skin. Seeing as it's Christmas, I thought I'd put up the little Christmassy picture on the left-hand side there, showing the young lady with her muff. Invariably, you get a Christmas card like that at Christmas, and there's some young lady with a muff, and I always wonder whether indeed her muff was some poor dog from Dumfries before it got into the Christmas card. If we go on to the next slide. Ditches, we've talked about those pretty well, but we've got to think about the scale of ditching that actually went on. At the bottom, we see the canal from the Dee, which is the Carlingwalk Lane, the one that was used to transport the marl off up northwards. But it was also used to drain Carlingwalk itself and lower the height by some 6 to 8 feet, I think it is. And all the little drains just to the north and south of this canal also are shown just above. And it's a huge work to undertake, especially without any JCB. And just to put everything into context as well, at the top there, what I've done is shown the estuary to the Nith. And you can see the darker blue wiggly line that runs through it, and then the lighter blue, almost pallid white, that is much shorter, much smoother and more direct, heading southwards. This is Walter Newell looking at how he can canalize the Nith in about 1840s. So huge lots of work that went into this sort of ditching. We'll go on to the next one. Rigs are also something that offered a huge amount of work as well. It's amazing where you do find rigs, and with LiDAR having come in, it's become more and more interesting to try and see what was there in the past. I have a picture at the top two is a picture of Little Wood Hill, which is kind of the top left of the estate that you're looking at rewilding, or whatever it is that you're calling this. And it's interesting to note that this hill did have rigs in it, and you can see the them on the right-hand side on the LiDAR photograph. On the left-hand, on the bottom, you can see another two images. This was just really to show that the directions of the rigs were actually recorded on the maps that the surveyors made. And you can see the rigs gently sloping on the right-hand side on the LiDAR, and they're also matched up with the rigs actually on the map. Next slide, please. Lines that might have been, there's a lot of things that might have happened. Just run through very quickly. Left-hand side, you've got the canal that ran from Kirkcudbright all the way up to St Johnstown, Dalry. You have another canal that was intended in the middle picture there from Carlingwalk running across country to the to join with the sea at that point. And then of course there's the canal from the Dee, but to me it's a large drain really still. We need to make it a bit bigger if we want to call it a canal. The other interesting thing were plans from Dalmellington down to Balcarry to run a railway line down. So these were lines that might have happened, but just didn't get to do the job. Next slide, please. There are also lines that we've lost. There's a whole history of transhumance in Dumfries and Galloway. This was based around the Douglases, and you have Gaelic names way up in the hills beyond Dalry, in the box up at the top there, which is basically this map on the left-hand side. It's the airy part of the place names that means summer pasture. So, and you would have had to have had roads in order to get cattle there, as they still have in various places of Europe. Next slide, please. So what is the future, especially for this project? If you remember that first map we had with all the wiggly lines, and I'm actually thinking that with a little bit of imagination, those wiggly lines can come back again, and you'll have a very different landscape for the future. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you, Archie. Yeah, that was really good, and I like that last comment about whilst this project is not looking to find some part of the future, some part of the past to make it the future. It's very much trying to learn from what the landscape potential has been in the past, which can shine a light on what it may be in the future. Now, just an aside there, you made reference to your mapping sources, National Library of Scotland. What I've done, for anyone who looks in the comments section, I've put a link through to the National Library of Scotland estates page, where Archie's team, he put an awful lot of maps up, amongst other people doing the same in Scotland, which can show you all these old estate maps, and many of them are also geo-referenced to modern ordnance survey maps. They're incredibly accurate. They do show how the landscape has changed over time. One question in the chat room there for you, Archie, is we'll let this one go because even though it's a little bit further away from Kelton, but it's referring to the Nith. And it's a Stephen Shellard. He's noted that in the parish of Crackia, which falls to the west of the Nith, just south of Dumfries, there's a small section east of the Nith that appears to be canalised. Was this a canalisation, or was it a change in the course of the river? Do you know, Archie?
Sorry, what was the?
Is it a canalisation, or was it a change in course of the river?
Well, down that neck of the woods, it could be either, quite frankly. I mean, there's a lot of that has gone on. There's a big, there's also burns that come in from the side, and they have more effect on the the way the water goes than you would think even possible. There is a little, what do you call it? It would look like a canal, if you like, that goes up past Carsthorne to the west, but I'm not sure about the east. I haven't sat in that cafe on the east side long enough to watch the tide go out.
I think in a lot of rivers in the south of Scotland, there's canalisation's been used in many of them, but for different purposes, often as part of land drainage, not necessarily to always for transport. And there's a lot of canalisation certainly happened over here in the east of the region in the 1930s to help drain land for the war effort. And there's a number of acts of Parliament which instigated that. Right, so if you want to drop into the chat room, Archie, and answer any questions, and maybe people. Our last presentation tonight is from Emily Taylor, who's just appeared on my screen. Now, Emily is the general manager at the Crichton Carbon Centre, and is an acknowledged peatlands expert, but also an acknowledged carbon expert. And we've asked, or NTS has asked the Crichton Carbon Centre to assess this project on a number of fronts, including its potential to capture carbon. So I thought I'd give Emily a chance to have a chat about the generals of the land's capacity to be a carbon sort of reserve and to capture carbon. So Emily, whenever you're ready, if you'd like to start sharing your screen.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Archie. Thanks, Sam. What a fascinating series of presentations tonight. I suppose my talk is kind of linking back to that idea that we have changed things. So Archie's talked a lot about how we have changed our countryside, our landscapes for our gain. Sam's talking about how they're making changes at NTS, and I'm probably talking about the changes we've made to our atmosphere. So I'll be bringing the talk back to kind of carbon, climate change, and kind of thinking about the Threave project in that sort of context. So I appreciate it's quite late on a Wednesday night, so this is not going to be a talk filled with facts and figures. It's going to be a talk that will spark some discussion, I hope. So it's just thinking through a few of the big concepts that we're hearing a lot about just now, but thinking about the Threave project through that lens. Okay, so next asked me to talk about carbon. So a mammoth topic in itself, how the land stores carbon. I think it's also really important, though, that we can't always just think about carbon. We have to be thinking about water, we have to be thinking about land and biodiversity, air more generally. So I'll be touching on all those things as well. It's very, very important that we think about our environment as a whole. But what's super interesting when it comes to land and land use and management now is the way that we're talking about land and what land can do for us. The terms that we use to describe the benefits we can gain from our land have changed significantly as we are dealing with the climate crisis now. Here's a word cloud, and I did this quite quickly, but I think a word cloud basically pulls out all the most commonly used words. The bigger the word, the more it's used. And this word cloud was created from the introduction to Scotland's land use strategy. And I think it's really telling, and it just really sums up the kind of rhetoric, the thought, the discussion that's going on now about land management and land use change. So we're talking about climate much more. We're talking about sustainability much more. We're thinking about new approaches to land management, land use. We do get biodiversity in there a little bit as well. We're talking about policies, people, benefits. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard the kind of phrases ecosystem services, natural capital. These are all kind of concepts that start to put a different sort of value on our land than we have maybe in the past. Land, of course, is very important from a carbon and climate point of view. So I'm now kind of bringing us down to Scotland. And here's a little graphic that shows the greenhouse gas emissions for Scotland back in 2018. So these are the most up-to-date figures we have from 2018. Now, land is really important in this context because you can see that lovely big green box at the bottom. Forestry in our land is actually sequestering carbon from our atmosphere. So what that means is taking carbon out of our atmosphere and locking it away in the forestry. However, land also releases carbon as well, and you can see this in the blue boxes. This agricultural and related land use almost negates the forestry gain that we're getting. So land is very important in the context of our emissions in Scotland and internationally. Very important indeed. So it's really interesting to think how we can increase the carbon sinks that we have and how we can reduce the carbon loss that we're seeing from our land as well. So changes in land use or changes in the types of management that we see on our land is seen as a way that we can help mitigate climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. So you'll see big targets now for forestry, new woodland creation, but we're also seeing big targets for peatland restoration. And of course, you've heard me here many times talk about peatlands and the role they play in carbon and climate change. Peatlands are a very significant carbon store. But we're starting to think about land use in carbon terms, and that therefore is driving management, it's driving the kind of support mechanisms that we're seeing coming through. So it's changing how we'll go about managing our land now and in the future. However, we've lost nearly half of our biodiversity in the UK. We are performing terribly. Canada, I think, still has 80% of its biodiversity. I think we're the worst in Europe in how we've performed when it comes to biodiversity. We've changed our landscape, we've changed our environment so much that we're facing a biodiversity crisis as well. And I think that's a really important message to take home. It cannot just be about carbon, it's got to be about biodiversity as well. So it's great hearing about a project like Threave, where they're starting to put biodiversity at the heart of what they're doing there, but using all the tools that we have, so using cattle grazing, removing fences, improving kind of habitat connectivity as well, all in an effort to support biodiversity. So we're facing a very, very major biodiversity crisis too. It's not just about climate change. We're also, maybe not apparently at the moment for us here in Scotland, facing a water crisis as well. There are very few alternative water supplies in Scotland. So it means if a reservoir gets polluted or a source gets polluted, very few places can we then switch that supply from. So we need to look after our water resource. We seem to have a lot of it all at once, and then we have droughts that we never used to. So we're seeing a change in our water patterns, our rainfall patterns as well. And a really interesting quote, and one that really stuck in my mind from a presentation I watched at the latest COP conference up in Glasgow. And this was a quote from Ian Macaulay, the CEO of Southern Water. And he said, every time you turn on your tap, you turn a precious resource into waste. That really hit home to me. So we need to think about carbon, yes, climate change, yes, we need to think about biodiversity, we need to think about water as well. We need to think about our environment as a whole. And again, hearing what Sam was talking about with the Threave project, that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to think about it all as one environment and how they can support the ecology, the ecosystems across their estate. So let's think about these kind of concepts, particularly carbon, in the context of Threave itself. So here's an amazing aerial photograph taken by Mike Bolam, which is very handy to illustrate some of the things I'd like to discuss. So firstly, carbon, where is the carbon? Well, I think a lot of us know that we have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. So we have elevated levels of carbon dioxide contributing to global warming. We also have a greenhouse gas called methane, which is 28 times as more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of its thermal kind of ability to heat our atmosphere. And these are two very significant greenhouse gases, and they are released naturally by our planet, by our land. Carbon dioxide is released through various processes. Methane released a lot from our wetlands. So they are naturally occurring. They're just at too high levels. It's starting to impact our climate. So go back to the land. Where is our carbon? Well, I think we're all very used to the concept of woodland, trees, forestry, big carbon stores. You can plant a lot of trees, will sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, lock it away into wood, into timber. So they're known as a carbon sink. Very, very important, takes emissions out of the atmosphere, locks them away in woodland. We think in Scotland, there's around about 50 megatons of carbon locked away in our vegetation. So really, really big number. However, what you probably don't know is there's actually 3,000 megatons locked away in our soils in Scotland. Soils are massively important carbon stores, really the most significant carbon store we have. So we need to be looking after our soils. And of course, peatlands, very, very deep peats, very deep layers of organic matter, huge carbon stores. About 53% of our soil carbon, we think, are stored in our peatlands. And you've heard me, as I said, talk quite a bit about the kind of restoration and management we're now doing on our peatlands. So soil is very important to consider at Threave, and there's been some questions about how we're measuring or how we're looking to monitor carbon at Threave across the project over the next few years. Well, they've already taken some soil samples, so we can actually look at soil organic matter, see how much carbon is in the soil. What will be interesting to see how practices changes, whether or not we can build that organic matter, build that soil storage capacity in the soils at Threave as well, build the soils themselves. So really the key thing here is thinking about how do we keep carbon stored away in our soils. So really good management of our soils to make sure we're not losing soils, we're not washing away, we're not losing carbon and organic matter from our soils. So we've also got wetlands. Again, massively important, lots and lots of organic matter. Organic matter really accumulates in these areas because they're very wet, so the decay process is not totally complete, so you get this kind of long-term layering up of organic matter. So really important carbon store in our wetlands as well. And we've heard, of course, that the wetlands themselves are very important habitats. So what else could we be doing? Well, we should be thinking about soils. Can they store more? So I think part of the project is understanding not only the benefits of, say, some of the grazing efforts we're seeing on the farm, how that can improve biodiversity. It might also be a way to improve our soil and organic matter in our soils. But it's not quite as simple and as clear cut as all this. You know, we have wetlands here at Threave. Wetlands are a really significant source of methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Globally, wetlands account for about 1/3 of our methane emissions to the atmosphere. So very, very important. So are we saying here we're going to increase our wetlands? Does that mean we're going to increase actually greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions to the atmosphere? Well, possibly. That might be a short-term thing. This is something to monitor. But really what we're trying to do here, we're thinking just beyond the carbon numbers in a kind of short time frame. We're thinking about trying to bring these ecosystems back into balance. And I think some of you may have seen this diagram before. I use it a lot when I talk about peatlands. So peatlands, a wetland, kind of looks quite brown and uniform and quite a slow moving sort of system. However, these wetlands, these peatlands are very, very dynamic in terms of all the different processes that are always ongoing. A lot of these processes are underpinned by the hydrology. So hence why kind of efforts to recreate more natural hydrological conditions at Threave are really promising, because we're likely to restore the functionality back to these wetlands and bring all these processes back into balance. So overall, what you'll end up getting is a net accumulation of organic matter. So we're thinking long term here when we're thinking about wetland management, soil carbon accumulation. This is not a short term thing. This is for the hundreds of years we're talking. Another really important thing is when we talk about wetlands and hydrology, we're talking about functionality. We're trying to return the natural function of these systems, and with wetland management, often that's just about managing water levels much better. And really this will help because we're also obviously facing climate change itself. So we need to make sure our systems are more resilient to climate change. The way we do that is make sure they're functioning very, very well. So this is a good way of making sure Threave can be long-term more resilient to whatever comes our way in terms of climate change, rainfall change, all that sort of thing. So it's really interesting, this project, because you know, we can understand the past, and Archie's done a really great job there of just showing us, you know, what this area used to look like, how we have changed it. And I think what I find fascinating is I look at those wiggly lines and straight lines and old maps, and that can often inform some of the management plans that I pulled together and restoration plans I pulled together for our peatlands, for example. So the past can really inform us. We're now understanding there's things that we can be doing in the present. The way that we can draw down funding for these kind of projects is changing. There's much more emphasis on multiple benefits of these types of projects. And we're seeing amazing things happening here at Threave already just now. However, the future, it's really difficult to determine. Sam's already touched on the fact that there's no single species in mind here with this project in terms of biodiversity. It's much more about functionality, ecosystem as a whole, trying to support populations that already exist, make sure they're more viable going forward into a future, because it is uncertain how these sort of sites will react to climate change, changes in rainfall patterns. You know, this will all start to be understood in the coming years. So really it's about restoring these ecosystems rather than trying to understand the kind of smaller parts, smaller elements to those systems. Restoring these systems as a whole will make sure that they're more resilient for the future. So really, we cannot just talk about carbon when it comes to land. We've got all these other things going on too, all these lovely birds and things. So purely if you were looking carbon terms, you might say, well, why don't we just plant all this up with commercial forestry or fast growing conifer forestry? Because that's going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere really quickly. But of course, we don't want to do that because we've got biodiversity in mind as well. We've got hydrological function in mind as well. So the carbon debate and need is often linked to so many other things. It's about balance. It's about understanding how all these components come together so you get the maximum benefits on all fronts from a project. And that may mean compromises on certain sides as well. Of course, here we're still farming Threave as well. We've still got amazing Galloway cattle, very good to eat, great local food being produced by the Threave estate. Cattle can also really help improve soil, and there's been lots of work in various places trying to understand the benefits of certain grazing regimes on actually building organic matter in our soil. So farming could actually help build carbon stores in our soils as well. And as Sam really reiterated, it's also about people at Threave. You know, we still need to have accessible areas at Threave. We still need to allow people to come and see and understand, walk about Threave as well. So there's already a kind of balancing act to try and make all these elements fit together. So all this requires really good site-specific understanding and consideration. What's really key is that we monitor changes as well. So we understand our starting point and we understand the changes that we're bringing about. So that might be measuring biodiversity, it might be measuring carbon. There was a comment earlier on in the chat box trying to talk about or understand how we might measure carbon. Measuring carbon is very, very resource intensive, very expensive. You need to do it for many, many years. I'm not saying that can't be done here, but I think what we'll be looking at doing is using metrics that indicate carbon emissions. So for example, with our peatlands, we understand peatlands in a certain condition, actively eroding, loses far much more carbon than something that's just been drained. So we start to get these metrics linked back to kind of simple indicators that we can evaluate on the ground much easier than going and studying everything with lots and lots of kind of carbon measuring equipment. So it's likely we'll start to look at metrics around carbon. What's interesting is there's already lots of work going on a soil carbon code. So this would be to try and assess carbon changes in your soils brought about by management. And that again, if you link that to a carbon market, that could be a way of bringing in funding long term to see carbon accumulation supported in our soils. So there's lots and lots of things going on, but really it's about understanding things at the site level, considering the wider impact. So not just considering carbon by itself, it's monitoring the changes and then reacting to those changes as well. So my talk was the land's capacity to store carbon, but remember, there's actually a whole lot more to it as well, which takes lots of thought, lots of consideration, but it's really fantastic that we've got a project like Threave happening in the Galloway Glens area that's starting to demonstrate all these different threads coming together. So thank you. I'll leave it there just now, but thank you very much. Open to any questions.
Thank you, Emily. That was, as ever, amazing and really clear and understanding. I think what you've done there, the whole reason, this whole series of talks, what I wanted to bring together was to, whilst I'm obviously, we're all bought into the idea that there's a climate crisis, that goes without doubt. Often the biodiversity crisis is kind of put to one side in policy, I find, and yet it is just as important for us. It should be just as important for everyone who lives in these islands as the climate crisis, because quite frankly, without biodiversity, we don't have much of a life either. So and that's why the Threave project is so important, but it's looking at it as a whole picture. So thank you very much. I haven't actually got any questions in the questions room. All I've got is plaudits, so that's pretty good. So I think that was really good. So Sam, I'm going to bring you in at the end. You've now left National Trust of Scotland at Threave. It wouldn't have started without your sort of vision to work with us and get this off the ground. So a big thank you. But what's your hope if you were to come back to Threave in 20 years' time? What are you going to see? Or what would you hope to see?
I'd hope to see. I'd hope to hear a lot of bird song. I'd like to see butterflies in meadow flowers. I'd like lots of visitors who are coming to see a project that made big changes to a much wider sector, almost pilgrimage to it in some ways. I think what also is really important is that we keep all these connections. That what I loved about this project was that it wasn't in isolation. The heritage of the site informs the decisions, and the hard science. So really, kind of Archie and Emily's presentations kind of bring in two important elements. And I think as well, one important part of what we're doing is some of the cultural elements as well. And I don't know if anyone seen it, but we had excellent John Duncan, the videographer, made a wonderful film on Threave ospreys that really captured the investment that had been made in terms of kind of time and love for the site. And I think it would be great to see how we get those kind of wider cultural responses as well to a project like this, because I think that we are living in an age of whatever you want to call it, the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. It is informing our lives in every possible way. And I think that this type of site will have a lot more meaning and symbolism for us. And it will be, I think, the heritage of the future. So we often think of heritage as being very historical. But this, I think we are creating new heritage, new natural heritage and new cultural heritage. And that's really exciting.
Thank you. And the thing I did like what you said there was about birdsong, because we talk about landscape restoration, but maybe we could talk about soundscape restoration as well. Everyone, that's been brilliant. So thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask everyone who's been in the Zoom rooms, sitting fully on mute, if you would like to maybe unmute yourselves and show your appreciation. I think the speakers have been brilliant, and we'll look forward to seeing you